Hello everybody and welcome back to the First Thursday Club from RSK Biocensus. Hope everybody's well. We're going to hear today from Matt Wainhouse, who's going to be talking about nitrate neutrality and biodiversity net gain in taking the OMG out of NN and BNG. I will let Matt describe a lot more of those acronyms as he goes through his presentation. Before we get on though, I wanted to go through some housekeeping. Those of you that have joined us before for these First Thursday Clubs will be familiar with this, but for the benefit of those that haven't, we will be muting microphones so that people can't heckle as Matt goes through. We invite questions, in fact, actively encourage questions, and using this software, there is a questions dialog box where you can type your questions in. What I'll do then, while Matt's talking, I'll be collating those questions, and then we can run a short Q&A at the end. So please add your questions whenever you can, and then we'll cover those at the end. After the presentation, we'll be emailing out a questionnaire. Please take the time to fill that in if you can. It helps us refine what we're doing with the First Thursday Club, and any feedback is welcome. Right, so to introduce our speaker today, Matt is a principal ecologist here at RSK Biocensus, where he spends most of his time working on our subsidiary company, Nature Positive and RSK Rewilding. He's a botanist and a mycologist and an advisor on nature-based solutions, habitat creation, biodiversity net gain, and environmental benefits from nature. He's doing a PhD in ecology and conservation of heart rot fungi, where he described a new to science species and has reintroduced 2 rare tooth fungi to a woodland where they'd become locally extinct. And just because he's got so much spare time, he's also a Winston Churchill Fellow, and he's researching on how international approaches to fungal conservation can be applied to the UK planning system. On top of all that, he somehow found time to write this presentation today. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Matt.
Great, thanks, Tim. So yeah, Tim certainly alluded to the fact that there was an awful lot of acronyms in the title to this presentation. And so I appreciate there's some people that might be here for the nutrient neutrality, the NN, and some for the BNG, the biodiversity net gain. If you're here for the OMG, you can log off now. I don't think this is for you. But just in very, very summary, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment. So nutrient neutrality is ensuring that there's no net increase in nutrients in sensitive or designated watercourses or wetlands. And biodiversity net gain is ensuring that all new development is going to result in more biodiversity than was present before development. So let's start off with nutrient neutrality. What's the problem? There's been a lot of very, very alarmist headlines, and for good reason. Nutrient neutrality is starting to hold up planning applications. Housing developments are not able to get their consents because of this nutrient issue. So unless they can show that they're nutrient neutral, they're just not going to get consent. So what's the problem here? It's all about nitrates and phosphates. And nitrates and phosphates are entering watercourses and wetlands, coastal systems, and causing eutrophication. So this is they're encouraging growth of plants and algae in particular that leads to big algal blooms, which then in turn soak up all the oxygen and start to deteriorate the quality of the habitat. So they're using up all that oxygen. Aquatic insects, fish start to die off. On the coastline, places like the Solent and Poole Harbour, where you have lovely big mudflats, these are starting to be colonized by algae, things like sea lettuce here. And what that does is it starts to damage the habitat for all of the benthic organisms, so all the annelid worms and the mollusks that are living deep in that mud aren't able to survive with all this algal blooms on top. And that in turn affects all the wading birds, things like this dunlin, foraging on the mudflats. It's changing their behaviour. It's starting to impact on their numbers as well. So this is the issue, but it sort of seems to have emerged out of the blue almost, and it comes down to something called the Dutch case, which sounds very much like 70s cop film, but is really a ruling from the European Court of Justice. And what the ECJ ruling in a case that was brought in the Netherlands was that any additional nutrient loading to a designated site that was already in an unfavourable condition would not be permissible. It would not be allowable by law. Now here, when we talk about designated sites, we're talking about those sites which are of a European, of an international quality. So these are really the jewel in the crowns, not just for the UK, but on an international scale, and specifically wetland habitats. Now, what the Dutch case, or the result of the Dutch case ruling, was that developments in catchments with any of these sensitive designated sites would need to demonstrate that there was no excess nutrient loading that was going to downstream of them that was going to affect their quality. But where is it all coming from, and how are housing developments partly responsible? Well, nitrates and phosphates are largely coming off of intensive farmland. So it's through the fertilizers we're chucking on our arable fields to grow our barley and our wheat. It's the slurry from dairy farms, it's pigs, it's chickens. They're all making a contribution to this diffuse nutrients entering watercourses. But also developments as well, housing developments are contributing through effluent, through sewage, detergents in that sewage entering the watercourses, and this is largely due to stormwater flooding, overrunning the sewer, and there being a discharge into the water network. Now, what this means is that residential developments, we can estimate what the nutrient loading might be, and as a result, we need to be able to demonstrate that there is measures in place to prevent that from happening, to prevent those nutrients entering the system. Otherwise, you're not going to get your planning permission. And so, just to give you an idea of what this kind of looks like in the scale of the issue, this is a map of England and Wales. And this is from 48 hours ago. This is a live map. And it was taken just after we had some heavy rain on Monday. And the green ticks show where there is no water quality alert in place. So there hasn't been a discharge of raw sewage into the coast within the last 48 hours. What these red crosses show are the opposite. This is where there has been effluent dumped into the coast, discharged into the coast. Now, it's a pretty grim picture. It does make our coastline look like an open cesspit. And certainly, if I was looking to buy a house with coastal views, I'd be looking on the Norfolk coast here. But we can also look inland at our river network. And so this is data from 2019 in and around Bristol, where I live. And what these brown dots illustrate are sources of, or point sources of sewage discharge into the river network. Now, the size of the circle, the size of the dot, it represents the size of the discharge. So this just here is just down the road from Salford, and the picture shows one of my favourite swimming spots, or at least it was one of my swimming spots, until I looked at this map and I read that in 2019 there was 82 overspills from the sewage water treatment works just down the road that spilled for over 1,000 hours. So you can see it's not just a biodiversity issue, it's not just the designated sites, there's also a human issue here. No one wants to go swimming with other people's turds. So BNG, to flip onto this for a moment, So biodiversity net gain is going to be an approach to development, or it is an approach to development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than it was before. Okay, so and what do we mean by a better state? What is a net gain? We're talking 10%, and this is what's going to be mandated in the Environment Bill if it ever gets passed. This might vary a little bit from project to project or local authority to local authority, and I've seen some local authorities go for 15%, others for 20% gain. But it's likely to be a general standard. It's going to be 10%. But why do we need this? Well, biodiversity is in crisis. It's looking pretty bleak. This is a global map of the world that shows the intactness of terrestrial biomes, of terrestrial ecosystems. So the dark green is wilderness areas, those biomes, those ecosystems that are most intact, most untouched by man. And the red at the other end of the spectrum is those which are most damaged by man. And if you look at the UK, square in the middle there, we're about as red as it gets. So we're in certainly from a global perspective, we're looking pretty bad. But if we zoom into the UK and start to look at some of the indicators, this graph is just one that kind of illustrates the biodiversity crisis and the situation we're in. And what this shows is the abundance, or the decline in abundance, of priority species. So this is a 60% decline from 2016 generally, and it's huge. And this isn't about diversity here. This isn't the number of species. This is about the abundance, so the population size of these species. And you know, I can even remember it when I was young, and seeing insects splattered across the lamps on the front of cars. How often do you see that now? And this is part of the issue. We just don't have the same abundance. We might have the diversity. We don't have the abundance there in our countryside. And it's a really, really worrying trend. But biodiversity net gain, although it's one approach to halting this biodiversity loss, for you guys, housing developers, it can be seen as a bit of an environmental tax. And so we are at the moment, it's a very nascent policy, and so it's a very nascent market. And so the unit price is very variable. DEFRA originally quoted 10 to 15k, that's what they were expecting, but it's going up to as much as £100,000 per unit, which is vast. But the vagrancies here, the variability means it's a little bit difficult to predict what your compensation would need to be, how much money do you need to put aside for this. And so one thing I will say actually is that some of that fluctuation in the price is dependent on the type of habitat. Some are going to need a lot more maintenance, a lot more fund for creation. But essentially, if you don't get that 10%, you're not going to get your planning permission. Certainly when the Environment Bill is passed and this is mandated. So water quality and biodiversity loss are, at least they have been, negative externalities of housing development. And so what do I mean by an externality? This is a positive or a negative consequence, so a benefit or a cost of an action that affects someone other than the agent undertaking that action, and for which the agent is neither directly compensated nor penalised. So you have negative externalities, these are unaccounted costs, and positive externalities, these are unaccounted benefits. Now, earlier in the year, we had the Treasury release of the Dasgupta review. And this review by Professor Dasgupta looked into the economics of biodiversity and certainly the role of biodiversity loss and the economics behind it. Now, in this, he talks a lot about externalities, and one of the problems is that we just haven't had the financial mechanisms, the financial tools to be able to really address some of these negative externalities. Now, he does point out that in a well-functioning market, they don't harbour these externalities. Essentially, everything is costed, everything, the value, everything is known. And so if you had a laissez-faire approach to externalities for nutrient neutrality, for example, we'd be looking at to I suppose pull those negative externalities out of the system altogether. You'd look at the contribution made by each cow, by each farmer, as well as each development. But this is a lot of information, and it's very difficult to create. We just don't have that. So instead, we're looking to regulation as a surrogate, and the regulation is really just a transparent mechanism so that we can start to account for some of these externalities on water quality and biodiversity loss, and that's where nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain are coming in. So now we have the rise of the metrics, and so anyone that has had even a brief flirting with either nutrient neutrality or biodiversity net gain will see that there's a lot of spreadsheet involved, a lot of spreadsheet action, and it can be quite frustrating. And on more than one occasion, I've been close to doing like this guy and smashing my laptop to pieces. But frustrating as they are, and I certainly didn't get into this game to look at spreadsheets, they are a useful tool. They help take the complexities of biodiversity or nutrient loading and digest it into a common language that we can all understand. Okay, numbers. Planners, your consultees, they're not hydrologists, they're not botanists, and so if we can look at a balance sheet, we can look at the pluses and minuses, and we can start to understand. We're singing off the same hymn sheet, the same spreadsheet. But yeah, these metrics, these calculators, they're transparent, they're objective. We have broad agreement in approach, certainly within an LPA for the nutrient neutrality calculators, or for biodiversity metric, sorry, for the biodiversity metric 3.0. This is going to be, I mean, this is right the way across England now. Scotland, Wales will probably follow suit with their own. But importantly, for you housing developers, we get predictable outcomes. Okay, we can know way in advance what you're going to need to contribute in terms of your commitment to, or to your compensation, sorry, for biodiversity net gain or for nutrient neutrality. So it's predictable. So just in sum, how these calculators and the metrics work. The nutrient neutrality is just looking at nutrient loading from your housing development. So first of all, we're looking in the red line boundary. What is the current land use? What is the contribution that land is already making to the nutrient loading? If it's a pig farm, it's going to be huge. And so just by taking that out of production, you're already bringing down that nutrient load. But that's not often the case, and we have to look at, well, what is the population density of your development? What's the soil type? These are all things that contribute and feed into this calculator. We include any mitigation measures. And then at the end of it, we have nutrient neutrality, when we see that after all of our mitigation, after all our compensation, there is no net increase in the nutrients going into the system. Now, biodiversity net gain works in takes a very similar approach. So to start with, again, you're looking at your red line boundary. What are the habitats in there? And we start to give them multipliers for distinctiveness to start with, and that's a measure of the uniqueness or the rarity of the habitat. It's biodiversity value. So our priority habitats, our woodlands, our species-rich grasslands, our heathlands, these are all high distinctiveness habitats. Our arable fields or intensively managed grasslands, these are at the bottom end of the scale. So these are low distinctiveness, low scoring habitats. But then we also give them a score for condition and a score for area, and we multiply these everyone, we get a unit score for that's what our baseline is, that's what the existing biodiversity value is, and that's what we need to beat by 10%. And so we then do the same process for our master plan. We look at the habitats that are there, give them a distinctiveness score, a condition score, but this time we're applying some negative multipliers. Now, the negative multipliers are starting to account for the risk of failure of that habitat. How difficult is it to create that habitat? But also, how long is it going to take to reach its target condition? How long is it going to be until the habitat is of the value that we say it is going to be, or that we want it to be? And then we also look at bringing factors around where that habitat is going to be created. How does it contribute to local networks? And then at the end of it, after we put in our compensation measures as well, we're looking to get that 10% uplift on what was there before. And that is where our biodiversity net gain is. So, does biodiversity net gain and no net loss equal OMG? Well, I don't think it has to. It really doesn't. But we need to start reframing this issue and moving away from it being this panic-laden acronyms or set of acronyms to something that we start to see the positives in, and certainly changing these negative externalities into positive externalities through the wider benefits that we can bring. So first off, avoidance. This is absolutely number one, your first port of call. Now, for nutrient neutrality, it might be that you shouldn't be building in, or want to avoid building within a catchment where there is one of these sensitive designated sites. Now, that's not always possible. Certainly, it's definitely unpalatable to say that you can't build anymore in Somerset around the levels. You can't build across half of southern England because of the issues in Solent. So in that instance, we have to look for other compensation measures. But certainly the same is true of biodiversity, really. And absolute number one, don't build on a high value habitat. You're going to have to offset a much higher compensation. You're going to have to provide much more offsetting further down the line if you do. So at this stage, it's really, really, really important that you have an ecologist as part of your screening. Let them guide that screening process and identify these issues really early on. Invite your ecologist to be part of your design team. Okay, let them show you and guide. This is going to cost you in terms of your units. This is a sensitive habitat. This is a habitat that's going to be worth more if you keep it here. But equally, it's not always going to be possible to do this. And certainly with biodiversity net gain, there's always going to be a loss of an intrinsic loss of some sort of biodiversity, even if it's an arable field or an intensive grass. There's always going to have to be some form of compensation or mitigation. And so here we start to look at habitat creation and habitat restoration. And this is the bit that's really, really exciting, especially as well as we can start to integrate nutrient neutrality with biodiversity net gain, and then to introduce a third acronym, EBN, environmental benefits from nature, what we used to call ecosystem services. But these are nature-based solutions. Okay, we're not relying on hard infrastructure as we might have done previously to solve something like the nutrient crisis. We're looking instead for nature to do this work for us. And when we start to do that, we do get all of these emergent positive externalities. So these are some of the things that we might want to do. You've got over here on the left some wetland restoration. You might want to do some woodland planting or some floodplain restoration. These are all things that are going to contribute not only to your nutrient neutrality, but your net gain as well. Then also you have all these extra multiple benefits. Your floodplain grassland is going to be cracking for pollination services or pest management that can then pan out across the landscape. Your tree planting is going to sequester carbon. It's going to do wonders for air quality. And of course, any natural green space is going to do wonders for the mental health and well-being of the people that are going to live in your housing development. So we can start thinking a lot more holistically, not just about nutrient neutrality or biodiversity net gain, but thinking about them both together, and certainly bringing in some of these extra things, these extra advantages, these extra benefits from having these habitats here. So we can look in the red line boundary at what we can start to do, and again looking at how we integrate these things. SUDs are perhaps the most obvious thing, so sustainable urban drainage systems. God, another acronym. And so this might be ponds, swales, green roofs, all of these habitats, all of this green infrastructure, this blue infrastructure that is going to hold back stormwater and stop the sewers from being overflowed. Constructed wetlands, they're going to hold back nutrients, they're going to hold back pollutants, they're going to stop them from entering watercourses, and then your designated sites. But they also have this biodiversity value as well. Certainly for biodiversity net gain as well, looking at other green infrastructure measures, things like pocket parks or micro woodlands. These again are all going to help to drive your biodiversity gains within your red line boundary. But I will offer a word of warning. So we're starting to see a little bit of criticism through some of the early adopters, and a lot of this has come from house builders, or at least critique of some of the master planning, where we're having very small patches of grassland where the ecologist is saying it's going to be wonderful, it's going to be the best condition ever, but actually you show that to a specialist, grass specialist, and they're like, no, it ain't going to happen. That is not going to be the biodiversity value that they're claiming it to be. So we need to be realistic about what we're saying is going to happen within our master plan. We need to account for things like long-term maintenance costs, for the impact of recreation and dog walking, all these kind of things, and be realistic about whether it's achievable. And ecologists who are listening, be honest about whether it's realistic. Don't fiddle the spreadsheets, because it is just a spreadsheet. It does not replace your professional judgment. So it's not always necessarily desirable to, or possible even, to compensate on your own within your red line boundary. For one thing, it might be it's just worth more to put an extra unit instead of a high value grassland in the corner of your development. And so you can start to look for offsetting off site. And this is really exciting because you can start to take a much more strategic approach to habitat creation. And this here is again my little area of Bristol, and you can see, and this is a nature recovery map. Now these were produced by Natural England a couple of years ago, and what they show is all of our priority habitats, so those high distinctiveness habitats that I mentioned before. And then it identifies where are the best places in relation to these habitats to create new habitat or to restore existing habitat. And this works on the Lawtonian principles, so bigger, better, more joined up. So this should start to guide where is the best place to put our offsite compensation. Where do we get the most bang for our buck? At a local level, we're going to start to see the emergence of local nature recovery strategies. Now, these will be mandated in the Environment Bill again, and each local authority will have a responsibility for producing one of these. And that strategy, again, at a local level, will show you where is the best place to create biodiversity. Where is it best to put a habitat, to put some restoration? But what are we going to do off-site? Well, perhaps firstly and most obviously, again, if we're looking at nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain, and certainly integrating the two, constructed wetlands, big wetlands, they're going to remove that diffuse fertilizers coming in off the land and hold those back, as well as point sources if you're going to put it near a specific farm that's having trouble with slurry, for example, or a wastewater treatment works, to intercept some of this wastewater downstream. And just to give you a little bit of an example of one of these, this is the River Ingle wetlands in Norfolk. The River Ingle is a chalk stream, and here it is just sort of running along here. And next to it is this water treatment work. Now, the River Ingle was suffering from high levels of phosphates, really, really high levels. So Anglican Water, together with Norfolk Rivers Trust and the Environment Agency, have created this constructed wetlands. Now, these two photos, the first one was in 2009 on the left. On the right-hand side, it's 2018. You can see these new wetlands where they've been created. And what happens is effluent flows out of the treatment works into pond number 1, and then gradually into pond 2 and pond 3 and pond 4 before finally being discharged back into the river with very, very little phosphates left in it. It's all been captured by the vegetation. It's all been captured in sedimentation. So instant benefit to water quality. But this is what it looks like now in 2021. This wasn't done for biodiversity, but biodiversity is thriving there. Look, it's just covered in marshy and emergent vegetation. The water quality might not be great, but still we're getting, there are sandpipers that have been recorded here, gadwall, oyster catchers, pied and greyed wagtails, chiffchaffs, toads have moved in. So we're seeing this very, very quick biodiversity benefit in a very short amount of time. But again, going back to some of these positive externalities, carbon sequestration. A wetland like this, about a hectare, is going to capture 4 or 5 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare, well, per year, which is a huge contribution. So we're not only looking at nature-based solutions to the nutrient crisis or the biodiversity crisis, but the climate crisis as well. So we're bringing this all together, and it's something to be proud of, and it's something to sing about. But it doesn't need to stop at wetlands. How about rewilding? Rewilding is an approach where it takes a very different direction, I suppose, to conventional habitat creation, habitat management, and essentially letting nature take care of itself. Now, the Isle of Wight, Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust are doing just this on the Isle of Wight. They've bought Little Duxmore Farm, and they've started a pilot study where they're rewilding the farm with help from some of these longhorn cattle as a nutrient reduction scheme. And how they're paying for this? They're selling the credits. So they anticipate this is going to create something like 800 credits sold for £2,500 per credit. So this will allow something like 400 houses to be built within the Solent. That's the equivalent that it's taken out. But it doesn't need to just stop at rewilding. It can take a much more conventional approach, and you can start to look at woodlands. Again, fantastic for biodiversity and also fantastic for carbon sequestration, for air pollution. And if you wanted to turn those positive externalities into something with market value, with a woodland, you've got carbon credits, you've got timber, nutrient neutrality. You have to be there in perpetuity, which I think is 100 years for some of these schemes, but certainly you've got a commodity there that might have value to you as well. Similarly with grassland, you can start creating species-rich grassland and potentially even looking at market value for working with water companies or local authorities for floodplain restoration to hold back floodwater. But the point here is really to be creative and with what you're doing and how you're going to achieve your nutrient neutrality and your biodiversity net gain. So I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but this is bringing us now really about to the end. And so what are the conclusions? Absolute number one is look at your avoidance measures, right? Get that ecologist to be part of your screening process. Let them be part of your design team. Help them, allow them to guide where you're going to put your infrastructure. Let them be part of these meetings and the master planning. Absolute number one. You're going to save yourself a lot of headaches down the line if you do so. Second, look for those opportunities for on-site green and blue infrastructure, but be realistic. Is it really going to, certainly with biodiversity net gain, is it really going to meet that biodiversity potential? Is it going to do what you're saying it's going to do? And if in reality it's not, maybe consider building another housing unit and looking to offset elsewhere where you might have a much greater impact. And I think for me at least, it's this offsite offsetting, both for nutrient neutrality and biodiversity net gain, where I think there is the most scope to be creative and to do really exciting positive things. You know, create your own habitat banks, create your own nutrient neutrality banks. You could even go out and sell those credits on, or those units on the open market. Work with farmers. A lot of them, the NFU, for example, you know, they recognise that a lot of the issue is coming from farming, and welcome partnership with farmers to build, construct wetlands to prevent some of the nutrients flowing into rivers. Work with each other. You know, imagine what you can do if a bunch of you house builders team up together and do something on a landscape scale. Wouldn't that be exciting? But equally, you know, if it's not your bag and you just want to build houses and have the problem go away, you can purchase your credits, you can purchase your offsets from a third party. And with the hard sell now, like Tim said at the beginning, I work with RSK Wilding, and we are specialists in habitat creation and habitat restoration, but specifically for biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality. So we can help you with all of these, from being part of that design team, from helping you with the avoidance, right the way through to helping to design exciting new habitats with all of these positive externalities that we've been talking about. So with that, I'll hand over back to Tim with any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. Very informative talk, as always. Yeah, we've got quite a few questions in, so without further ado, we'll kick off with those. One of the ones I liked specifically was regarding the River Ingle example. I noticed that a woodland had been felled to make way for the habitat creation. Excuse me. What biodiversity was lost? Was there a real net gain?
Well, good question. Now, firstly, that wasn't a net gain scheme. Okay, so that was looking at reducing phosphates going into a chalk stream. Now, you've got to maybe take a global perspective here, and that is that chalk streams are one of the a globally rare habitat, of which the UK has a large portion of the world's, really. And so here, I suppose there is a trade-off, but also being reflective about how long that woodland's been there. But yeah, you're right. If you were going to take a net gain approach, which we certainly would do now, we would, and we wanted to fell that woodland if we felt that the river was going to benefit from that, then yeah, we would look at replanting certainly something equivalent. We wouldn't want to lose that. But yeah, I do appreciate that there's definitely a trade-off there.
Thank you. Okay, how does long-term maintenance factor into the BNG calculations?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it is neglected, and I've mentioned some of the early adopters sort of saying there was going to be these fantastic looking grasslands stuffed in the corner of the best development. And then when this was presented to sort of grassland specialists, they sort of went, well, I don't think so. But yeah, and I think that's because there hasn't been any thought about the maintenance or what it takes to manage a grassland. Now, one of the approaches that we're taking with Wilding is to, when we're doing a habitat restoration or habitat creation over a 30-year period, which is typically what we're talking about for biodiversity net gain, we're building these costs up from the ground. Okay, so when we're going to give you a price per unit, we're thinking, okay, what is going to be the cost for either buying that land or leasing that land, for the tree planting, the cost of stock, fencing, all of these things that sort of go into the habitat creation. But then you're right, the long-term management as well, there is a cost there. And I think once that is accounted for, it certainly might be a lot less attractive to be doing things within your red line boundary. And it might be better to start thinking about offsite, and certainly handing some of that responsibility over to a third party. But it absolutely has to be. Habitats don't manage themselves, except for rewilding maybe. But even then, you still need the cows.
Yes, true. Can ill-designed sod systems actually contribute to nutrient loading?
Oh gosh, we're really stretching it. My knowledge here, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the same way that I guess a poorly designed biodiversity scheme is going to contribute to biodiversity loss, you're not going to hit a net gain. Yeah, totally. I mean, if you're going to build a constructed wetland and you haven't really factored in the flows and how how those nutrients are going to be captured, then yeah, it totally could make things worse. But yeah, like I say, very, very on the edge of my knowledge there with with that.
Fair enough. on the edge of, well, beyond mine. If the demand for housing continues to increase and developers advised not to build on high diversity land, surely we will run out of space. It isn't sustainable, is it?
I don't know. I mean, driving through the countryside, there's still a lot of space there, and certainly we need to do a lot of food production. Obviously, we don't want to take food necessarily out of food production, but to give you a flavour, I mean, anaerobic digestion at the moment, we're growing something like 120,000 hectares of maize to go into AD plants, which contribute a very, very small amount of methane. So it's there are big subsidies for it, and so yeah, I think it's a bit of a myth that we're running out of land, to be honest. And oh, sorry, what was the question again? Just remind me.
Well,
I feel like I strayed off the plot a little bit.
If the demand for housing continues to increase, which I guess we all expect it to,
which
developers are told or advised not to build on on high diversity land, then basically we're going to run out of space.
Right, yeah, okay. Well, the answer is that yeah, high diversity land there's not a lot of it, if we're being honest. Most land is arable, it's intensive grass, it's been absolutely hammered and damaged, it's of low value. So there's really nothing to worry about there, I don't think.
No, yeah, from a personal point of view, I'd completely echo that. Yeah, there's plenty of low diversity land available. It might be green and people might like looking at it, but it's usually completely devoid of any wildlife because it's, like you say, it's been farmed, and farming it doesn't encourage that usually. Okay, I'm just going to have a couple more questions. I think we've got a bit more time. Does the focus on habitats as a proxy for biodiversity mean that certain taxa miss out?
Yeah, quite possibly, but I mean, how many taxa are there in the UK? You know, we're talking thousands upon thousands. I think we've got, so the ecology really, and certainly in relation to development, is very much focused on the priority species, those protected species, your bats and your dormice and what have you. And this has been at the detriment of a whole lot of other taxa. Now, what we're doing by looking at habitat is habitat forms a basis for all things. Everything's got to live somewhere. But yes, some things will like a woodland, some things will like a grassland. And if you build a grassland, if you create a grassland, you're not going to be supporting those things in the woodland. So yes, we have to be mindful of it, but I think it's still a much better currency than taking a single species focus, because just by habitat, we're looking at a much broader spectrum, and we need to keep that in mind, I think.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so a final question, I think. Following the Lawton principles, isn't it always better to offset off-site?
Well, good question. Yeah, I mean, ideally, if you're building somewhere that is of low value and you've got that opportunity, then yeah, building off-site within your local nature recovery network is where it's going to really bolster that local network, is going to be probably the best thing you can do, and you're going to have really, really high gains. Again, it's this thing about more bang for your buck. But the flip side of that is that people still want to look out their windows in their brand new houses and see green space. You still want to, it's nice to see a pond as part of your development. It's nice to see trees, and they have really big impact on your personal mental health and your well-being. It makes the development to some extent more valuable. And so the answer is yes, but don't forget about some of the other benefits that we lose if we take all of that green space away and put it somewhere else.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Thanks again for a great talk, and thanks everybody for joining us today, as always. It's probably just final thing for me to say is that the next First Thursday Club will be on the 4th of November. Stephanie Ray will be talking, reporting back really from, or talking about COP26, not reporting back, I should say, it's in advance of that. But anyway, her title is How to Avoid Missing the Point When Hitting Net Zero, and that will be on the 4th of November. So just to remind you to fill in that questionnaire when you get sent it, pass the word on about these webinars, the First Thursday Club, and we'll look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks very much.